Julia, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm going to give a little introduction, although it seems odd because we know each other so well.
Indeed.
However, I will read this bit out in case I get it wrong. Rabbi the Baroness Neuberger, you recently retired as Rabbi of the West London Synagogue. You're a crossbench member of the House of Lords and a trustee of numerous charities. You write and broadcast widely and have written several books on subjects ranging from being Jewish to end-of-life care to decision-making in the NHS. You were a member of the Runnymede Commission on Antisemitism and on its Commission for Islamophobia. And since February 2019, you have been chair of University College London Hospitals. Your book is called Antisemitism, What It Is, What It Isn't, Why It Matters. That's a pretty big subject, and I think we should explain why it is that I, a music critic, sitting in Wigmore Hall, a place I'm very familiar with, should ask you, a rabbi of another faith from one I was brought up in, Anglicanism, why I should be talking to you. And I think it's probably because you asked me because we've been friends for many years.
Indeed.
And it's not something we've ever really talked about. And for me, it's not something I'm an expert on. I have the sort of general knowledge that anyone who would want to know about civil society would have about anything in any sort of human terms. But I read your book and it made me realize that I have many questions which perhaps would make this conversation slightly different from the sort of punch, here's a point of view, you're giving an opposite point of view of most current affairs discussions, and actually make it more about what it is to live with the issues that you're discussing in your book. So what I was struck by reading from where it begins, which would perhaps be a good place to start, is your own childhood and your background and your parents and growing up in North London and not really knowing that this was an issue.
It is extraordinary on reflection to think that I was born in 1950, 5 years after the Second World War. My mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany. My father's mother chaired the Welfare Committee of the Refugee Committee in this country. My grandparents on my father's side had also come from Germany, but before the First World War. They'd all lost huge numbers of family members who had been deported and murdered. And, you know, my grandmother, who I was very close to, her own mother was deported from Amsterdam, where she'd gone for safety, from Frankfurt in Germany, and died. I mean, she was murdered in Sobibor. So the end of that was 5 years earlier. And yet, growing up as very obviously Jewish, little girl in North London, you know, I was not conscious of anti-Semitism. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people who had been through the experiences of the Holocaust, who were refugees, who, indeed some of the ones who came afterwards, didn't want to talk about it. I think that was a time when people weren't talking about it. But equally, I was surrounded by people who had spoke with German accents. It didn't seem remarkable, but I suppose, you know, you're always used to whatever happens when you're a child. And being Jewish was very public. And, you know, we had new clothes. I and my cousins had new clothes for festivals, and we'd walk around in our sparkly shoes for Hanukkah.
You were not an Orthodox family.
We were absolutely not an Orthodox family. Indeed, on my mother's side, they were really almost not observant at all. I'm very consciously Jewish, but not observant. We weren't Orthodox. You know, the boys and girls were treated equally because we were Reform Jews. But, you know, there was absolutely no sense that there was anything to worry about. And I went to a girls' in those days public school day school trust school, South Hampstead, and about a third of my year was probably Jewish, and nobody turned a hair. We just didn't do any difficult new things on big Jewish holidays because there wasn't much point. Too many of us weren't there.
So I suppose you were born 5 years after the war, which is nothing. Now
Absolutely
that
nothing.
we are older, we realise how short 5 years is, but when you're a child, you wouldn't have had that consciousness until you were perhaps 10, 15.
Yeah. And I think that the first consciousness came probably with my mother very occasionally talking about how she felt about her parents when I was in my teenage years. And I think my grandmother was really traumatized by being a refugee, and you know, she was already in her 50s. And my grandfather developed dementia and was haunted by images of being pursued by the Nazis, which he never was. But nevertheless, it was in his head, and it was really distressing. So obviously, as I got older, I became more aware. But also the public became more aware. I mean, there'd been lots on newsreels in the 1940s, but then in my childhood, there was very little, things like Exodus, the book. But then I think in the 60s, more of it came to the fore. And the older I got, actually, more and more people were talking about it, writing memoirs of what happened to them. And that's continuing, because there's still quite a lot of German and Austrian refugees still alive, many of them coming to the Wigmore Hall regularly on Sunday mornings. And they feel the end of their life is coming near, and they are, many of them, recording their experiences.
And did that same feeling of being very safe in your upbringing, your birthright, if whatever would come onto that, whatever we like to call it, right through university, say?
Absolutely, through university, on becoming, studying to become a rabbi, it all felt pretty safe. And I do think there's something, and that perhaps is something we'll talk about in a minute as well. I do think there's something about Britain feeling like quite a tolerant place. That doesn't mean there isn't racism. It doesn't mean there isn't anti-Semitism. But broadly, your encounters with everybody are pretty civil and pretty civilized. And I think that I felt that right the way through. Yes, there were odd anti-Semitic remarks when I was a student at Cambridge, not from fellow students, but from other people, but so little, and it just wasn't an issue. And indeed, wasn't really an issue till the beginning, essentially till the beginning of this millennium. And even then, not really an issue in this country.
So I think before we get too deep in, I should ask you to define, as best you possibly can, given that it's the subject of the whole book, what anti-Semitism is.
What anti-Semitism is a hatred, a prejudice against, a negative view of Jews. I think it's really important to state that being critical of the state of Israel does not mean you are an anti-Semite. But if you start saying that all Jews are responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, you are verging into anti-Semitism. And it's really in the relationship between Jews and the Jewish people and the state of Israel where most of the complications have arisen, although in recent years, and particularly in recent months and weeks, some of the anti-Semitism is real old-style anti-Semitism, nothing to do with Israel at all.
Could we just give a very short overview, could you give a very short overview of where it all started without doing too many centuries of detailed history, but it does go back a very long way.
It goes back a very long way. You can track it back to an Egyptian historian called Manetho. It was there in the Roman world. It was there in the early Christian world. I think that the beginnings of Christianity, which partly grew out of Judaism, and then the gradual view that Jews were Christ killers. So it goes back to that. And then the feelings that Jews should be punished in the long term or for eternity for being Christ killers, that modern Jews, if you like, were responsible for the killing of Jesus. So it goes right back. And I think it's worth saying that in the Muslim world, there was very much less anti-Semitism historically, but that in probably the last century, and particularly in the last 80 years, that has changed, but it's differently formed. It doesn't have a theological basis in the same way. And actually, if you look at references to Jews in the Quran and in Muslim literature more generally, if at all, they're more figures of fun than evildoers. So I think it's a very different view.
And what about the caricature tradition?
The caricature tradition goes back a very long way. So in the Middle Ages, the church, the Lateran councils, increasingly required Jews to wear a special badge or a special hat. I mean, the Nazis didn't invent anything new with the yellow star. And so that goes back to 1215 and in some places probably earlier. And that led to, the special hat particularly led to a tradition of caricatures of Jews. And so you've got a tradition of caricatures of Jews going back into the Middle Ages, which then gets picked up with a completely different view of the world, which is a 19th century view of the world about race, sort of the new anthropology, the new so-called scientific anthropology, which says that you can define us by race and that we're all, very different, and some are superior and some are inferior, the roots of much modern racism. And that, and we all know that there's only one race and it's called human. But the fact is that, people were saying that blacks are different from Jews and Aryans, and particularly this was a very much a German and German-speaking thing, and French actually, Vacher de la Pouge, that, you could measure people's skulls and that would tell you a great deal about their superiority or their negativity. I mean, I could go on for hours about that. You don't want me to. But it is worth saying that the second half of the 19th century produced this so-called scientific race theory, which began to say that Jews were inferior in a whole variety of ways, but at the same time regarded them as super clever and very tricky.
Because there are all these conspiracy theories that seem to be grossly simplistic, which say Jewish people run everything.
Yes,
they have
and
the
that's
power.
later. That's actually, that is the
start?
very beginning of the 20th century, almost certainly started, perpetuated by, written by a monk in Russia, and it's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It purports to be this document saying Jews are taking over the world, but written by Jews, of course. It was proved a forgery very quickly. Actually, the Times of London proved it was a forgery in 1921, and were very clear, this is a load of old rubbish, and dangerous rubbish at that. But it stuck. And you can buy copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is around on the internet. We'll come on to some of the stuff that you get on social media. It's around on the internet all the time. And people still believe that Jews run everything, that they're super clever, that they're super rich. I often feel I don't really know how to argue about some of that, except to show you loads of Jews who are actually very poor and don't run anything at all.
And one of the points that you make in the book, which I think I was aware of without so explicitly knowing, was that many ways of life were not open to the Jewish people. They had to take jobs as moneylenders or things that have become, in a sense, the downfall in the sense of caricature.
Yes, so I think the particular thing that it's worth saying is that, again, going back to the Middle Ages and the Lateran councils, Jews were forbidden often from owning land, in fact, almost always from owning land, from quite a lot of straightforward manual labour. I mean, they weren't allowed into the guilds, so they couldn't become craftspeople, which I actually find quite strange because part of my family were craftspeople, in fact. But a lot of difficulty, agricultural labour, whatever. So what was open to them? Well, what was open to them was money lending, particularly at a time when the rule that said you shall not put out your money at interest, which comes in the Psalms and various other places, was very much felt within the Christian church. And so therefore, a Christian couldn't lend money at interest to another Christian. So you couldn't have
very convenient group of people.
So you couldn't have a convenient economic system. So you had your small group of people, the Jews, who would be the moneylenders. Often the moneylenders to armies, to kings, to dukes, whatever. And very often Jews in medieval Europe were protected by the rulers, but hated by the mob because, in fact, quite often they charged quite high rates of interest because they were so likely not to get the money back. But that's one of the reasons. And it was later, it was the late Middle Ages, when the Italians came in, the Lombards came in, Lombard Street in London, and took over quite a lot of the banking. But one of the reasons that so many Jews were in money lending, and in fact later on peddling small goods, but one of the reasons was they weren't allowed to do other things. You can look at different parts of the world where there were Jewish populations, and you can see almost always not owning land, rare to own land. So in Russia, Poland, often they were publicans, moneylenders.
Science has benefited from this.
Much later, because you know, for a very long time, Jews couldn't get a proper education. Later, they were musicians, and that's relevant for here. traditionally, of course, portable musical instruments in case you had to move. So very much stringed instruments, and there's a long and strong tradition of Jews playing musical instruments. But, the piano was later.
I think we perhaps ought to come on to the fact that that really the prompt for writing your book, and it could not be more current now, was that you absolutely were aware a certain few years ago, I'll ask you when, that things had changed, and that this tolerance that you were so supported by, really through most of your growing up and working life, you've been able to be a female rabbi. That in itself is still an exceptional thing. But that has changed. What has happened?
So I think it's worth saying that from the beginning of this millennium, there were more and more anti-Semitic incidents around Europe, eventually in America as well, Argentina, actually some of that at the back end of the last millennium. So there was a mood change, clearly, and people wanted to go for Jewish targets. Now, lots of Muslims were having this. There were lots of Muslim targets too, but let's just talk about Jews at this point. So that was changing. It was particularly bad in France. And there are various, people will remember the Charlie Hebdo stuff, and then there was the attack in the kosher supermarket, Hyper Cacher.
It's still very bad in France.
It's still often very bad in France. And there was a bombing in Copenhagen. There was an attack in Italy. Italy having a history of being pretty tolerant of Jews. There was a quite nasty attack in Italy, etc., etc. And gradually Jewish organizations and others started keeping records of these attacks. So that was the background. And then the foreground, and that's what made me so angry and made me write the book. And I wrote the book, broadly speaking, in 8 weeks. So if there are inaccuracies in it, I apologize.
It's a powerful read.
Thank you. Well, it was a bit of a rant.
It's you in your synagogue.
I was so angry. And that was with Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, and therefore other people who were followers of Jeremy Corbyn, who felt that it was totally okay to say some very anti-Semitic things, and there was a real issue about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Now, let me just lay this on the line. There's anti-Semitism in the Conservative Party, there's anti-Semitism in the Lib Dems, there's anti-Semitism on the right, there's anti-Semitism on the left. But the major political party, the official opposition, was seeing a great deal of anti-Semitism and doing nothing about it. I found deeply shocking. I ought to add to that I grew up in the Labour Party. Both my parents were ardent Labour Party members. My mother had been a communist in Germany before the war. Being communist and Jewish really was careless. And, I just was so angry. And there were particular instances that made me very angry. And one of them was the cartoon, which keeps coming back, and again, you can find on social media as much as you want now, which was done by an artist who calls himself Mere One. And it was in Tower Hamlets. And it showed, and it could have come out of Der Stürmer, it could have come out of a Nazi publication. It shows a sort of small group of men with very hooked noses. Caricature doesn't even begin to enter into this. With a Monopoly board, and the Monopoly board is balanced on the backs of clearly poor people. And this is like the protocols of the Elders of Zion. These are the people who are plotting and taking the money and basically oppressing the poor. And the then mayor of Tower Hamlets and the authorities in Tower Hamlets were very shocked by this and cleaned it off. And it was a Muslim mayor, Lutfur Rahman, who's been in trouble for other reasons, but he was absolutely admirable on this. Anyway, and Jeremy Corbyn, without looking at it properly, almost certainly, defended this mural. And the idea that he wasn't clued up enough to look at this and say it's an absolute bloody disgrace.
I think he was comparing it with another, with the removal of the Diego Rivera.
He was in Rockefeller Center in New York. Indeed, he was.
I think it was the principle of free art.
It was the principle of free art and free speech, and we can come back to the issue of free speech. But the fact that, I think the thing that's important is, he's a leader of a major political party and couldn't see it, and had to have it pointed out to him that this was seriously anti-Semitic. So you can say what you want about free art and free speech, but when it becomes hate art and hate speech, it's a whole different ballgame. And he couldn't see it, and I was furious. And then there was more and more examples of him or his followers making or allowing anti-Semitic comments. And then there was the Panorama programme, where various people who'd worked in the Labour Party dealing with complaints of anti-Semitism spoke out, and Corbyn's own sort of, if you like, group, his coterie, tried to discredit the programme, at which point I lost patience.
All those things are very real. We have a different leader of the Labour Party.
We do indeed.
And I think you should say what you think is possible and what you would most want Keir Starmer to do.
Well, he's already doing it, which I think is important. And Keir Starmer's a whole different ballgame. And he made it very clear right at the beginning that he was going to deal with this, and he is dealing with it. And as people will probably know who are listening and watching, the Labour Party has actually settled with the people who sued the Labour Party over the Panorama programme when they were being discredited. So he's recognised that there's a problem. Various people have been thrown out. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who didn't take down something that was anti-Semitic on her social media accounts, was forced out of her front bench role. He's taken action. What do I want him to do? I want him not only to do that, because you need to do that. That's, if you like, the first stage. The second stage is to be talking regularly with the Jewish community. That's always difficult because, 2 Jews, 3 opinions isn't a joke. There's so many of us with different views.
I read that joke somewhere.
Yeah, I know,
in your book.
and it's true. But, he has to have relationships with different sections of the Jewish community and build up trust. He's beginning, but there's a long way to go.
This could clearly be a whole issue, and as we haven't got people from the Labour Party to put forward a view, I think we should just accept what you've said there as part of your reasons for writing the book, the prompt for writing the book.
Yeah.
Clearly this issue is so much bigger than the Labour Party.
Oh, much.
And comes from all directions
Absolutely.
of politics and society. And that is really something that we need to address in the here and now, because just this week there's been an issue which led to a cooling on Twitter of many vocal people who observed a 48-hour self-ban on Twitter.
They did, and
that.
this is a rapper called Wiley who spewed out anti-Semitism on his Twitter account and then in his real name on a Facebook account, and Twitter and Facebook did not take it down. And, they'd been asked to take a view on this, they'd been asked to deal with this, and one of the things I say in the book is, I'm a real free speech defender, but sometimes these platforms, they're publishers. They need to actually control what's there. They need to, if there's hate speech there, it needs to go. They didn't do anything. As a result, there was a campaign, and Tracy Ann Oberman, the actress, was one of the leaders of the campaign, getting all sorts of people on side to have a 48-hour ban on the use of Twitter. And they absolutely stopped. And it was very high-profile people, from the Prime Minister, all sorts of church people, all sorts of Muslims, loads of people of all kinds. It wasn't particularly or entirely Jewish by any stretch of the imagination. And it was a very solid, it had an effect. They actually took it down. He now has a ban. He's been banned. But, he was effectively asking for Jews to be shot. And in his personal Twitter thing, he was saying, that Jews treated blacks like slaves. And it was just appalling. It included the fact that his then manager was somebody who was Jewish, who was, really, really shocked and upset by all of this. And this is current stuff. It's not going away. And when the 48 hours was over, Tracy Ann Oberman went back onto her Twitter account. I'm not on Twitter, but she went back onto her Twitter account and faced with the most disgusting tweets directed at her, which I think it might be worth me actually reading out because they're so disgusting.
Yeah.
So Tracy Ann Oberman opens up her Twitter account on Wednesday morning. I'm going to read what she gets. The first tweet of the morning to me read, I'm not going to say the words in total, effing shut up, sticking your nose into literally everything apart from an oven where it actually belongs. And it's worth knowing that Tracy Ann Oberman's own she had family who perished in the Holocaust, including sort of grandparents. And she was taken, I can't imagine why, but they actually took her to see Holocaust memorials when she was 4, and she still got it in her head. So, I mean, that's just completely appalling. And, if you look at the abuse that quite a lot of high profile, particularly Jewish women, it's quite, it's anti-Semitic and misogynist. If you look at that, it's pretty depressing. But I think the thing that is comforting about all of this with Rapper Wiley is that the great British public and all this enormous support that wasn't remotely Jewish, actually it does tell you that people think this is not okay. And that's the thing that gives me comfort and makes me feel that, yes, there is anti-Semitism, and a lot more anti-Semitism in this country probably than when I was a child, but that actually most people think it's disgusting.
I think that's almost the point we can end. But there's a final section of your book that I found very potent, which asks the question, what does it feel like? And it's partly what we've been talking about this past half hour. But could you just tell me a little bit more about what it feels like?
What it feels like is it makes me angry. It possibly should make me nervous. It doesn't actually, but it just makes me incredibly...
It must make a lot of people nervous.
It does make a lot of people nervous. It particularly, interestingly, makes people nervous who are this older generation of people who are themselves refugees. Refugees from Nazi Austria and Germany. Some of them feel very, very nervous and also feel very, very grateful to Britain. But it makes me very angry. And it makes a lot of people that I know, like Tracy Ann Oberman, very angry. And it also makes you feel, in a way, perhaps that I didn't feel before, that, if you're a female rabbi, you're pretty obviously Jewish and pretty publicly Jewish at that. But it does make me feel like standing up to be counted. It does make me feel like saying, I'm not putting up with this. And I suppose what I feel is, if the book is of any use in saying, this is pretty disgraceful and it's not to be tolerated, that's great. And if we can turn this round so it becomes completely unacceptable and you only see anti-Semitism on the fringes, which is where it's always been, I'll be quite pleased. I mean, I'd really quite like to see a stage, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when this book will be completely unnecessary and we can just bin it.
Well, I should do the advertisement for you and say I hope people will read it who wouldn't have thought themselves that they needed to read about anti-Semitism because they might think it doesn't affect them. It's actually about how we behave as human beings to each other, and that's of the essence of everything you cover in there. And there are some very disturbing things, but there are also some very generous, exactly as you've just described, the way that people do come out and support.
Absolutely.
And that most people don't want this hatred to be something so institutionalized that we can't rid ourselves and see people as equal. But I think that might be the shred of optimism that you always hang on to that keeps you going.
It certainly is. And I have this sort of faith in the great British public because actually, I think on the whole, they don't like this. They don't like racism. They don't like anti-Semitism. It was apparently an issue on the doorstep in the last general election. In the old Labour heartlands, they didn't like the anti-Semitism. It wasn't as big as some of the other things about Jeremy Corbyn, but it was there. People said it on the doorstep. People who live in areas probably where there aren't very many Jews or any at all just don't like it. Well, good. And I think it does say something about how we should behave to each other. The other thing I suppose it made me feel very strongly is that social media has a lot to answer for. It's of great benefit in various ways, but it has a lot to answer for because it allows people to say things without actually owning them. Mm. And so people say some pretty unpleasant things. And it's not only anti-Semitism. The combination of anti-Semitism and misogyny is quite powerful. But just look at some of the hate stuff that's been directed at Muslims, at black people, bizarrely, with all the praise of the National Health Service through this COVID-19 thing, look at some of the hatred that's been expressed against nurses. And you think, well, you could really invent it, could you? It's extraordinary.
Well,
and I
even
think that's
as
important.
A mere female music critic, it's interesting how you can say something wrong about Beethoven's Fifth and get some pretty rude comments. And that's something that we love, music. But let's stop there. Julia Neuberger, we've been privileged to have the Wigmore Hall to ourselves, so let's come together, and I hope that people will read this book.
Thank you so much, Fiona.